It was late one Friday night, and my friends and I were crammed in a dim, cluttered basement. We had decided to try out an old Ouija board that one of us, Luke, had found in his grandmother's attic. He claimed it was antique, one that his grandma used to swear by during her spiritual phases. Something about it looked wrong. Too used, worn almost to the point of tearing. But like the morons we were, we all brushed it off as nothing. Just a cool vintage find. We set the board up, using the only available light. A single bulb that flickered from time to time, making the shadows dance across the room. It was me, Luke, and two others, Dan and Matt, who thought this whole thing would be hilarious. And at first, we laughed, asked silly questions, waited for the planchette to move. But it stayed stubbornly still, mocking us. We were about to pack it up when Dan suggested, in his usual reckless way, that we ask something more sinister. Let's ask if it's ever hurt anyone. He smirked, eyes glinting in the half-light. I laughed nervously, but my stomach knotted up. Luke seemed to hesitate, but eventually, we all put our fingers on the planchette again. Has anyone ever been hurt by this board? Dan asked, barely able to keep from laughing. For a few seconds, nothing happened. I almost exhaled, half relieved. But then the planchette moved. Slowly, painfully, it slid over to yes. We all froze, fingers trembling, adrenaline starting to pump through my veins. I glanced at Luke, he looked pale. Who got hurt? Luke asked quietly, barely above a whisper. The planchette began moving again, forming letters, spelling out a name. Evan. A chill swept over us. None of us knew an Evan, but there was a raw, undeniable sense that whatever we'd contacted knew what it was doing. Then it spelled another message. Heishere. He is here. Dan read out, his voice barely more than a cracked whisper. My heart hammered against my ribs as I glanced around the room, half expecting some shadow to step out from the walls. Luke scoffed, trying to sound brave. Okay, funny. If you're here, then prove it. But his voice cracked at the end, betraying his fear. The planchette jerked violently to one side, then slowly began sliding in a slow, deliberate circle. We all stared, wide-eyed, hands glued to the board. Then, out of nowhere, the light bulb flickered wildly and died, plunging us into near darkness. A sickly, cold sensation crawled up my spine, as though the room itself had come alive, watching us. A few seconds of silence passed, just the sounds of our breathing and a soft rustle, like something moving in the shadows around us. Matt, who was always the tough one, muttered something under his breath and turned on his phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off the walls. That's when we saw it. In the far corner of the basement, just beyond the reach of the flashlight, stood a figure. A tall, hulking silhouette. Its head was bowed, but even from that distance, I could see something wrong with its posture, like its joints were bending in unnatural angles. Dan, his voice barely a whisper, said, Who's there? The figure raised its head, and I swear it smiled. Its mouth stretched too wide, filled with too many teeth. We scrambled, tripping over each other as we tried to bolt up the stairs. Luke was the last one out, clutching the Ouija board as though it were his lifeline, eyes darting back down the stairs, where the basement loomed like a dark, open maw. We slammed the door shut, breathing hard, adrenaline running high. None of us dared speak for a few seconds, too afraid that we'd invite whatever that thing was up the stairs. Finally, Dan broke the silence, voice barely steady. We have to burn it. That board. But Luke interrupted him, shaking his head. I don't think that's going to work. Why not? I demanded, the words coming out sharper than intended. You saw it. We can't keep this thing. Luke swallowed hard, his gaze flitting from the door to the board. Because I'm pretty sure it's part of my family. I think that's my Uncle Evan. He disappeared when I was a kid. My grandmother. She used to say that he wandered too close to the other side. A cold silence settled over us. We all stood there, paralyzed, as the figure seemed to take a step forward. The air grew colder with each second, as though the very presence of this thing was drawing the warmth out of the room. Dan's phone light trembled, the beam flickering weakly across the figure's face. But it was Luke's reaction that terrified me the most. He whispered, almost to himself, "Uncle Evan?" The figure stopped, tilting its head ever so slightly. For a moment, the silence was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Then, the figure let out a low, guttural sound that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a word, not a laugh or a groan, but something inhuman. An echo from a place far darker than any of us could imagine. "Luke," I whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice, "we have to get out of here. Now." But Luke just shook his head, his eyes locked on the figure. "No, I think he wants something." Dan finally broke, grabbing Luke by the arm and practically yanking him back. "I don't care what it wants, man. This is not normal. We're leaving right now." As he dragged Luke toward the stairs, the figure suddenly surged forward, its movements sharp and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by strings. It reached the bottom of the stairs, stopping just at the threshold as though some invisible force was holding it back. Its head tilted, its empty eyes fixed on us, and then it smiled. It was a wide, unnatural grin, stretching too far across its face, showing rows of teeth that were just wrong. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, but all I felt was a primal, instinctive terror. "Let's go," I practically shouted, shoving Dan and Luke up the stairs, forcing Matt to follow. We bolted up the steps, not daring to look back. The basement door slammed shut behind us, as though it had been closed by some invisible hand. Once we were out of the basement, I fumbled for the locks, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the latch. Finally, I got it secured, and we stumbled back, breathing heavily, trying to collect ourselves. But as we looked at each other, we all had the same thought. It wasn't just in the basement anymore. Felt like it was everywhere. Luke was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to end this." "How?" I demanded, frustration and fear bubbling over. "It's not like we can just throw the board away. It's attached to us now. You said it yourself." Luke took a deep breath, looking more haunted than I'd ever seen him. "There's one way. My grandma told me once. She said if you ever see something from the other side, you have to make it think you belong there, that you're already dead." The silence that followed was thick and horrifying, but I saw the resolve in Luke's eyes. He turned and picked up the Ouija board, his hand steady despite the terror written across his face. "We're going back down," he said, voice low and calm. "But this time, we're not asking it questions. We're telling it. We're one of them." "Are you insane?" Dan hissed, backing away, his face pale. "We barely got out of there alive. You want to go back down?" Luke's gaze was steady, unblinking. "If we don't finish this now, it won't stop. It'll follow us. It'll never let us go." I could feel the weight of his words, the horrible truth of them. Whatever that thing was, it had been waiting for us, waiting for the chance to latch on and never let go. If we left now, it would haunt us forever. So, against every instinct in my body, I nodded. "All right, let's do this." We gathered back around the Ouija board, our fingers trembling as we placed them on the planchette. The basement felt even colder now, and I could sense the darkness lurking just beyond the circle of dim light. Luke took a shaky breath, his voice a hoarse whisper as he spoke. "We are here, with you. We belong to you." The planchette immediately jerked, as though some unseen hand was pulling it. It moved quickly, circling the board, faster and faster, until it finally stopped, hovering over a single word: dead. My stomach dropped, and I felt a pressure settle over us, like something heavy pressing down on our chests. The air grew colder, and suddenly, I felt a sickening, dizzying sensation, like I was being pulled, my vision blurring at the edges. Then, a voice, low, distorted, and chilling, whispered, "Prove it." Before I could react, the planchette flew out from under our hands, hitting the wall with a loud crack. The light bulb above us flickered violently and then burst, plunging us into darkness once again. But this time, Something else was in the room with us. I could hear it breathing, right behind us. The sound of its breath was slow, deliberate, and raspy, like each inhale scraped against something raw and broken inside. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body felt glued in place. I couldn't move. None of us could. We were trapped in that pitch-black basement, surrounded by a silence so thick it seemed to smother us. Then, I felt it. A faint, icy touch on the back of my neck. It was as if a clawed finger were tracing a line from the base of my skull down my spine, tasting my fear. I swallowed, barely able to keep from screaming. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and I could feel my friends standing as still as statues around me, their terror radiating in waves. And then that low, twisted voice spoke again, so close it might as well have been whispering directly into my ear. "You said you belong here." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "Yes, we're dead. We belong here with you." A tense silence followed, stretching out until I could hardly bear it. I was about to whisper again, to try to break the silence, when the voice chuckled, a horrible, wet, gurgling sound that echoed around the basement. It was the kind of laugh that made my stomach twist, that made me feel like we were all prey trapped in some horrific game. "Then prove it," the voice rasped. "Show me how you died." A tremor ran through me, and I looked desperately to Luke in the darkness, hoping he'd know what to do. But his face was a ghostly pale blur in the dim glow of Dan's flickering flashlight. He looked just as terrified, just as lost. But then Luke spoke, his voice cracking as he forced the words out. We died in fire. We burned up, just like you." The figure, still barely visible, seemed to shift closer, as though considering his words, tasting them. And then, with a horrible, jerking motion, it leaned forward, its empty, hollow eyes boring into Luke. "You lie," it hissed, with a voice that seemed to echo from somewhere deep in the walls around us, filling the room with an intense, sickening cold. I felt dread fill me like ice, sinking down to my bones. There was no way out. This thing. It knew us, saw through us, saw our fear as clearly as if we'd handed it to him on a silver platter. And it wasn't buying our story. Just then, Matt snapped. He bolted, stumbling backward toward the stairs, gasping, "I'm done. I'm out. I can't do this." The figure's head whipped towards him, a smile stretching grotesquely across its face. Before I could even process what was happening, Matt's flashlight slipped from his grip, tumbling to the floor. The dim beam lit his face for a brief second as he backed away, and then the figure moved. It was so fast, so horribly fluid, that for a split second it looked as though it wasn't moving at all, just a blur of darkness streaking towards Matt. He let out a strangled scream as he stumbled backward, tripping over the bottom step. The figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes staring down, and it reached out with hands that were nothing but shadows and bones. "Leave him alone," Luke shouted, his voice shaking, desperate. The figure paused, those empty, cavernous eyes turning slowly to look at us again. It tilted its head, as though considering, and then its mouth opened in that unnatural, too-wide grin. "Why should I?" it whispered mockingly. "You invited me in." A chill shot down my spine. It was right. We had opened the door, invited this thing to cross over, and now it was here. And it didn't intend to leave without taking something with it. Then I remembered something. Something my grandma used to say about spirits and the other side. She'd always warned me that if you ever opened the door to the dead, you had to close it yourself with your own life energy before it could close on you. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to speak, voice barely above a whisper. "We will close the door, but you have to go back." The figure's smile faded, its expression turning cold and calculating. For a moment, it didn't move, just stared at me as though assessing my words. But then, it nodded. Luke looked at me, eyes wide, realization dawning. He understood what I was trying to do. Together, we placed our hands back on the board, barely able to keep them steady. I could feel the cold weight of the figure's gaze on us, that sickly grin still hovering in the dark, but we ignored it. We focused on the board, on the idea of pushing this thing back to where it came from, of closing the door for good. Luke whispered, voice shaking, "Goodbye." The planchette shot to the word on the board with a violent final thud. The air seemed to shiver, the darkness itself vibrating as a terrible, bone-chilling wind swept through the room. For a moment I thought it hadn't worked, that we'd failed, and this thing would drag us all down with it. But then the pressure lifted, the darkness lightened, and I felt the horrible cold begin to recede. The basement door, which had somehow closed during the ritual, creaked open again, spilling faint light down the stairs. The figure was gone. We sat there in silence, barely breathing, until we realized we had survived. We sat there, huddled around the Ouija board, barely daring to believe we'd made it out alive. The silence was thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. Slowly, we began to stand, each of us stiff and shaken, but alive. Matt was the first to break the silence. "So, it's over, right?" Luke and I exchanged a look, but neither of us said anything. There was something about the air, some heaviness that hadn't lifted, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. But I nodded anyway, hoping that maybe, if I believed it, it would be true. We went upstairs, each of us moving like we were in a dream, too drained to think, too scared to linger. The house was quiet, but not the comforting kind of quiet. It was an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles after something terrible. As we stepped outside, the cold night air hit us, bringing a strange, almost surreal sense of relief. It was over. We were out. We'd survived. We all lingered near the porch, not ready to split up just yet. Dan was the first to speak. "So, what do we do with the board?" He looked back at the house, where the Ouija board still sat in the basement, like a dark relic we'd left behind. Luke shook his head, his expression grim. "We can't just leave it. That thing's connected to my family. If we don't destroy it, someone else could end up like my uncle." I shivered, the memory of that twisted figure still fresh in my mind. "Then we burn it. Get rid of it for good." Without another word, we turned back to the house. The idea of going back inside made my skin crawl, but I knew we had to. Whatever we'd set free tonight, we couldn't risk letting it linger here, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. We crept back into the house, the air thick and heavy again. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak and groan of the floorboards making my heart race. I could almost feel eyes on us, watching, waiting, as though the house itself had taken on some kind of sinister life. The basement door stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. Dan hesitated, looking at us with wide eyes, but Luke pushed the door open and led the way down, the rest of us following, too afraid to be left behind. The board was still there, right where we'd left it, but something about it had changed. The letters and numbers seemed darker, more defined, like they'd been etched deeper into the wood. And the planchette, it sat dead center on the word goodbye. Luke took a deep breath, then bent down to pick up the board. But as his fingers touched it, the air around us grew cold, and a low, ominous hum filled the room. Before any of us could react, the planchette moved. It slid slowly, deliberately, spelling out a single word: "Forevr." I felt a chill slice through me, cold and sharp, and every hair on my body stood on end. The room grew darker, the shadows creeping closer, and I realized with dawning horror that we hadn't finished it. The thing we tried to send back, it was still here. Luke looked up at us, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. We have to burn it. Now." We didn't waste another second. We bolted back up the stairs, the Ouija board clutched in Luke's hands like a cursed relic. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling around us in icy gusts as we grabbed matches and lighter fluid from the garage. Without ceremony, we poured the fluid over the board, dousing it until it was slick and shiny. Luke struck a match, his hand trembling, and dropped it onto the board. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden roaring whoosh, flames leapt up, bright and fierce, crackling as they consumed the wood. The fire was intense, too intense, as though it were feeding on something more than just wood and paint. But as the flames grew higher, An awful, piercing sound filled the air. A scream, hollow and distorted, like it was coming from some dark place far beyond. I covered my ears, wincing, but the scream only grew louder, filling the night, echoing off the trees and houses, so loud I could feel it in my bones. The flames twisted, rising up in strange, unnatural shapes, almost like faces contorted in agony. And then, with a final, violent burst, the fire died down, leaving only ashes and a thin wisp of smoke curling into the night. We stood there, frozen, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. None of us spoke, too shaken to find words. But as I looked at the pile of ashes, I felt lighter, like a dark cloud had lifted, like we'd finally been freed from whatever horror we'd unleashed. Luke let out a shaky breath, a faint, relieved smile crossing his face. "It's over," he whispered, but just as he said it, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just shadows, except one shadow was darker, denser, like it was watching us. A chill ran down my spine, and I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But as we walked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. And as I climbed into the car and looked back at the house one last time, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window. It was smiling. As we drove away, the house receded into the darkness, but the feeling of that smile lingered like a stain in my mind, refusing to fade. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and our shaky breaths. Every one of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd just experienced, if that was even possible. I glanced over at Luke, who was staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked haunted, as if he'd aged overnight. I could see the weight of what we'd done hanging heavy on him. Whatever that thing was, it had been part of his family's past, and I wasn't sure it was finished with him. Dan, sitting beside me, suddenly shivered, rubbing his arms. "It's colder now," he whispered. "I swear, I still feel it, watching us." His words hung in the air, sending a new wave of dread through me. I felt it too, that prickling sense of being observed, followed, like some shadow had slipped into the car with us, settling into the quiet spaces between our breaths. I think we just need to forget about it," Matt muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Pretend it never happened. Move on." I wanted to agree, to say that it was just a bad memory we could lock away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. We had opened something, a door to a place that humans weren't meant to see, and some part of that place had slipped through. The rest of the drive was silent, each of us wrapped in our own uneasy thoughts, until finally we dropped off Luke at his house. He nodded to us, eyes dark and hollow, then turned and disappeared into the shadows of his front porch without a word. One by one, we each went home, though none of us could bear to sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light made me jump, my mind racing back to that basement, to the cold, empty eyes of the figure, and to that terrible, haunting smile. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of shadowy hands reaching out, of hollow voices whispering my name. Days passed, and though we tried to move on, none of us could shake the feeling that something had come back with us. We stopped talking about the board, stopped calling each other, each of us drifting into silence as we tried to outrun the memories. But the fear lingered, a constant, unshakable presence, like something watching from just beyond the corner of my vision. Then, one night, about a week later, I got a text from Luke. It was just 2 words. "It's back." My stomach dropped. I wanted to ignore it, to tell myself it was a joke, or that he was just seeing things. But some horrible part of me knew it was real. I texted back, asking if he was okay, if he needed help, but there was no response, just silence. The next morning, I drove to his house, heart pounding with every step. When I got there, the place was dark, the windows shut tight. I knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. His car was in the driveway, but it was like he'd vanished, disappeared just like his uncle had all those years ago. As I stood there, Staring at the empty house, I felt a chill creep over me, a cold, heavy presence settling in the air. In the window, I thought I saw a shape, a figure watching me, smiling that horrible, empty smile. I didn't stay. I turned and left, my heart racing, refusing to look back. Luke was gone, and whatever we'd let in, it wasn't finished. I haven't spoken to Dan or Matt since. We don't need to. We each feel it, living in the shadows, watching from the corners of our lives, waiting. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for us, one by one. I still feel it sometimes, standing just behind me, hovering in the mirror when I pass, lingering in the darkness when I turn off the lights. The thing we unleashed that night, it doesn't want to let go. We thought we could close the door, that we could send it back. But we were wrong. And now, it's only a matter of time.